Racist cop slaps a black kid, not knowing the man they feared most was watching. The sharp crack of a slap echoed through the bustling park. A collective gasp rippled through the air as bystanders turned to see what had just unfolded. Officer Jason Carter, his face flushed with anger, stood towering over a young black boy who was clutching his cheek, tears welling in his wide eyes. Jason's hand hung in the air for a split second longer, as if even he couldn't believe what he'd just done. Unbeknownst to the officer, in the shadow of an old oak tree stood a man whose mere name struck fear into the hearts of many who dared to abuse their power. His arms were folded across his chest, his eyes as cold and piercing as steel. The man had been silent so far, but his mere presence promised a storm that was about to be unleashed. Before anyone could say a word, Jason barked, "Don't you dare move, boy. You think you can get away with stealing around here?" The man under the tree stepped forward, and though he said nothing, the air seemed to thicken with tension. Jason turned toward the movement, his confident sneer faltering for just a second. "Who are you?" he asked, though his voice didn't carry the same bravado it had just moments ago. The man didn't answer. He simply kept walking, his steps slow and deliberate. And then, earlier that afternoon, 10-year-old Jamal Williams was running errands for his grandmother. She'd sent him to the corner store to pick up some bread and a carton of milk. It wasn't anything unusual for Jamal. His grandma, Miss Ruby, had bad knees and couldn't get around much, so he helped out however he could. Jamal loved the park near the store. On sunny days like this one, he often stopped there on his way back, watching the older kids play basketball or the families having picnics. The laughter and chatter always made him smile. As Jamal walked through the park with his small grocery bag, a soccer ball rolled toward him. A group of kids playing nearby waved at him, asking him to kick it back. He placed the bag down and gave the ball a strong kick. It flew perfectly, landing right in front of one of the boys, who cheered. "Nice one," one of them called out. Jamal grinned, feeling a warm sense of pride. He picked up the bag and was about to head home when he noticed a man in a police uniform walking toward him. "Hey you," the officer shouted. Jamal froze. His heart began to race as the officer approached, his expression hard and accusing. "Where'd you get that?" Jason asked, pointing at the groceries in Jamal's hand. "My grandma sent me to the store," Jamal answered, his voice trembling slightly. "Don't lie to me, boy," Jason snapped. "I've been watching you. You've been sneaking around here like you're up to something. Let me see that bag." Jamal hesitated, unsure what to do. His grandmother had always told him to be respectful to police officers, but the way Jason was looking at him made his stomach twist. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said quietly. Jason's eyes narrowed. "Don't talk back to me," he shouted, snatching the bag out of Jamal's hand. He rummaged through it, finding nothing but the bread and milk Jamal had bought. "This your excuse? Trying to play innocent?" Jason demanded. Jamal shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything." Jason's face turned red. "You little punk, you think you're smart, huh? I don't buy it." Then, without warning, Jason raised his hand and slapped Jamal across the face. Around the park, people stared in shock. Some whispered among themselves, unsure whether to intervene. Others fumbled with their phones, recording what was happening. Under the oak tree, Samuel King watched it all. Samuel wasn't a man you'd forget once you met him. He was tall, with a commanding presence that seemed to fill the space around him. His reputation preceded him, an activist and retired lawyer who had built his career fighting cases of racial injustice. People often called him the Shadow of Justice, a nickname he'd earned for his relentless pursuit of accountability. Samuel had come to the park to clear his head. He wasn't expecting to see something like this, but now that he had, he knew he couldn't stay silent. As he stepped forward, his mind raced. He thought about Jamal, who looked no older than his grandson. He thought about Jason, whose actions reflected a deep-seated prejudice that Samuel had spent his life confronting. And he thought about the crowd, who needed to see what courage looked like in the face of injustice. Jason was too focused on Jamal to notice Samuel's approach. "You think you can steal and get away with it?" Jason growled. "I didn't steal anything," Jamal sobbed, holding his stinging cheek. Jason sneered. "Yeah, that's what they all say." That was when Samuel's voice, calm but firm, cut through the tension. "Let the boy go." Jason turned, startled. For a moment, he seemed unsure of who Samuel was or why he was there. But when their eyes met, Jason's smirk faltered. "Who the hell are you?" Jason demanded, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments ago. Samuel took another step forward, his gaze never wavering. Someone you're going to regret crossing. The crowd, sensing that something big was about to happen, grew quieter, leaning in to watch. Jason squared his shoulders, trying to reassert his authority. This is none of your business. Samuel tilted his head, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at his lips. You just made it my business. The tension hung heavy in the air as the confrontation between the two men unfolded. Some in the crowd whispered Samuel's name, recognizing him from news stories and courtrooms. Jason, however, remained defiant, unaware that the man standing before him was someone he should have thought twice about provoking. And then, just as it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more intense, Jason's radio crackled to life on his shoulder, briefly distracting him. He glanced down, fumbling to turn the volume down, clearly rattled by the interruption. The pause allowed Samuel to close the gap between them, his towering presence now impossible to ignore. "Officer," Samuel said, his voice steady but unmistakably commanding. "What evidence do you have that this boy has committed a crime?" Jason stiffened. "Look, I don't need some wannabe lawyer lecturing me about how to do my job. This kid's been sneaking around. That's reason enough." Samuel's expression hardened. "So, suspicion gives you the right to slap a child? To humiliate him in front of a crowd? Is that how you serve and protect?" Jamal's quiet sobs broke through the tension, and Samuel turned to the boy. "Son, are you hurt?" Jamal hesitated, his cheeks still red from the slap. "I'm okay," he said softly, though the fear in his eyes betrayed his words. "Don't talk to him." Jason barked, his voice rising. "I'm handling this." Samuel ignored him, kneeling down so he was at Jamal's eye level. "What's your name?" "Jamal," the boy whispered. Samuel nodded. "Jamal, I'm here now. You're safe." Jason took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "Step away from him. You're interfering with a police investigation." Samuel straightened, his sharp gaze locking onto Jason. "And you're interfering with basic human decency. If you don't step back and call for a supervisor, you'll be answering to more than just me." Jason scoffed, though there was an edge of uncertainty in his demeanor now. "I don't need backup to deal with you." "Maybe not," Samuel replied, his tone unflinching. "But I guarantee you'll need a lawyer when this is over." The crowd murmured, emboldened by Samuel's confidence. Several people were recording the exchange, their phones aimed squarely at Jason. The officer seemed to notice for the first time, his eyes darting nervously toward the onlookers. "Everyone needs to back up," Jason shouted. "This is a police matter." But the crowd didn't budge. If anything, more people were stepping closer, their faces a mix of outrage and determination. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "Because every word, every action, is being recorded. And I promise you, there will be consequences." Jason's jaw clenched, his bravado rapidly crumbling under the weight of the moment. He glanced around, realizing he was outnumbered, not in force, but in resolve. The tide of public opinion was clearly against him, and he knew it. "Fine," Jason muttered, stepping back slightly. "I'll call for backup." As he reached for his radio, Samuel turned back to Jamal. "Where's your family, son?" "My grandma's house," Jamal said, wiping his tears. "I was just getting groceries for her." Samuel gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll get you back to her, I promise." But before he could say more, the sound of screeching tires interrupted the moment. A patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out. One of them, a middle-aged black man with a badge that read Sergeant Davis, surveyed the scene with a critical eye. "What's going on here, Carter?" Davis asked, his tone sharp. Jason's confidence seemed to return now that backup had arrived. "Caught this kid acting suspicious. This guy," he gestured at Samuel, "is interfering." Davis's gaze shifted to Samuel, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Mr. King," he asked, his voice softening. "Is that you?" Samuel nodded. "It is. And I suggest you take a very close look at your officer's behavior before the situation escalates further." Davis turned back to Jason, his expression darkening. "What exactly happened here, Carter?" Jason hesitated, clearly unsure of how much to say. I suspected the boy of theft. He was being evasive, and I..." "He slapped the child," Samuel interjected, his voice cutting through Jason's excuses. In front of witnesses. For no reason other than his own bias. Davis's jaw tightened as he looked at Jamal, then at the crowd, who nodded in agreement. "Carter," Davis said, his tone icy, "did you lay hands on this child?" Jason faltered. He was resisting. "I had to." "You had to?" Davis snapped, his voice rising. "You had to slap a 10-year-old? Are you out of your mind?" The crowd murmured in approval as Davis stepped closer to Jason, his anger barely contained. "You're done here. Hand over your badge and weapon. Now." Jason's face turned pale. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Davis said. "And if I hear one more word out of you, I'll be the one filing charges." Jason's hands shook as he removed his badge and holstered weapon, handing them over to Davis. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Samuel remained stoic, his attention focused on Jamal. Davis turned to Samuel. "Mr. King, I'll personally see to it that this officer is held accountable. And I'll make sure the boy and his family are safe." Samuel nodded. "That's a start. But this isn't over." As Davis escorted Jason to the patrol car, Samuel knelt beside Jamal once more. "Let's get you home," he said gently. But just as they were about to leave, a voice from the crowd called out, "Hey, what about the rest of them?" Samuel froze, turning toward the voice. "The rest of who?" he asked. A woman stepped forward, her face grim. "There were 3 other officers earlier, harassing kids at the other end of the park. They left before all this happened." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his mind racing. "Where did they go?" The woman pointed toward a side street. "Down there. They looked like they were in a hurry." Samuel stood, his expression resolute. "Jamal, I'll take you to your grandmother soon. But first, I need to find out exactly what's going on here." And with that, he turned toward the street, his heart pounding as he prepared for whatever awaited him next. Samuel's steady stride toward the side street was a declaration in itself. The crowd began to disperse slowly, though a few curious onlookers trailed at a distance, unsure of whether they should follow. Jamal tugged on Samuel's sleeve, his small hand trembling. "Do we have to go there?" the boy asked quietly. Samuel stopped and knelt, his face softening. "Jamal, I promise I won't let anything happen to you. But sometimes, when bad things happen, we have to stand up and make them right. You're brave, and I need you to stay brave a little longer." "Okay." Jamal hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Samuel stood, holding the boy's hand as they continued down the street. The quiet neighborhood suddenly felt ominous, each shadow stretching long in the afternoon sun. The side street led to an alley that opened into an industrial area lined with warehouses. In the distance, Samuel could hear muffled voices, sharp and agitated. He followed the sound, his footsteps careful but purposeful. As they rounded a corner, the scene came into view. 3 officers, one white, one Hispanic and one black, stood in a semicircle around 2 teenage boys. The teens, both black, were backed against the brick wall of a warehouse, their faces pale with fear. One officer jabbed a finger in one of the boys' faces. "Don't act like you don't know the rules here," he said, his tone dripping with menace. "We didn't do anything," the boy protested, his voice cracking. "We were just walking home." The officers exchanged a glance, smirking. "Walking home with what?" the Hispanic officer sneered. "Those shiny shoes? That new backpack? Don't play dumb. You're trying to hustle something." The black officer, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "Let's just search them and be done with it." His tone was cold, almost indifferent, as if this was routine for him. Samuel's voice, calm yet forceful, broke through the tension. "That won't be happening today." The officers turned in unison, their expressions shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Who the hell are you?" the first officer demanded, taking a step forward. "Someone who's tired of watching people like you abuse your badge," Samuel replied. He released Jamal's hand and gently pushed him back. "Stay behind me," he whispered. The white officer smirked, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "You think you're some kind of hero? This is none of your business." Samuel took another step closer, his piercing gaze making the officer falter slightly. "It became my business the moment you decided to terrorize children." He looked at the teens. "Are you boys okay?" One of the teens nodded hesitantly. "We're fine for now." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Good. Stay where you are. I'll handle this." The Hispanic officer laughed, the sound hollow and mocking. "Handle this? You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." Samuel didn't flinch. "You have a choice to make. You can walk away right now and pretend this never happened, or you can stay and deal with the consequences of your actions." The black officer, who had been silent, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just let them go," he muttered, avoiding Samuel's gaze. The white officer turned on him. "Are you serious? We're not letting them go just because some wannabe lawyer shows up." Samuel took another step forward, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "You should listen to him. Because if you don't, everything you've done today will be on record. And I will make sure it haunts you for the rest of your life." The white officer's smirk disappeared, replaced by a scowl. "Are you threatening us?" Samuel shook his head. "No, I'm promising you. And if you want to test me, be my guest." The tension was palpable, the alley silent except for the faint sound of traffic in the distance. The Hispanic officer's hand twitched near his baton, but he didn't draw it. The black officer took a step back, his unease growing. Finally, the white officer huffed. "This isn't worth the paperwork. Let's go." The Hispanic officer hesitated but eventually nodded. "Yeah, whatever. They're not worth it." The black officer exhaled in relief. "Fine." The three officers turned and began walking away, their footsteps echoing down the alley. Samuel didn't move until they disappeared around the corner. He turned to the teens, his expression softening. "Are you both okay?" One of them, a tall boy with dreadlocks, nodded. "Yeah, thanks to you. What's your name?" Samuel asked. "Deshaun," the boy replied. He motioned to the smaller teen beside him. "This is my cousin Malik." Samuel nodded. "Deshaun Malik, you're safe now. But we need to make sure they don't do this again. Will you come with me to the station to file a report?" The boys exchanged a nervous glance. "Will it really make a difference?" Deshaun asked. Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It will. I'll make sure of it." As they walked back toward the park, Samuel's mind raced. This wasn't just about Jamal or Deshaun and Malik. This was about a pattern of behavior, a system that allowed people like Jason and his colleagues to act with impunity. But Samuel wasn't afraid of the fight ahead. He had faced worse before, and he would face worse again if it meant protecting the next generation. As they approached the main street, a patrol car screeched to a halt in front of them. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, a high-ranking officer whose face Samuel recognized immediately. "Samuel King," the officer said, his voice dripping with disdain. "I've been hearing a lot about you today." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Good. Then you already know I'm not backing down." The officer smirked, his hand resting on his hip. "We'll see about that." And with that, the battle lines were drawn. Samuel stood firm, his resolve unshaken, as the officer's challenge hung in the air. The crowd from the park had begun to gather again, their presence a testament to the growing tide of accountability. Samuel knew this was just the beginning. But he also knew he wasn't alone. The officer standing before Samuel was Captain Bradley Hayes, a man whose reputation preceded him within the city's police force. Known for his staunch defense of his officers, regardless of their actions, Bradley was infamous for protecting the blue line at all costs. Samuel squared his shoulders, his stance calm but defiant. Around him, the crowd began to murmur, their numbers steadily growing as more people stopped to see what was happening. Jamal stood close to Samuel, his small hand clutching the edge of Samuel's coat for reassurance. Deshaun and Malik exchanged wary glances, unsure of what to expect next. "Captain Hayes," Samuel said, his voice carrying an air of authority that matched the captain's own. "If you've come to justify what your officers did, save it. The people have seen enough today." Bradley's smirk deepened, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of irritation. "Mr. King, I've heard about you and your activism. You have a knack for stirring up trouble where there isn't any." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call it? Trouble? When children are harassed and assaulted in broad daylight by the very people sworn to protect them." The crowd erupted into murmurs of agreement. A few people raised their phones, recording every word of the confrontation. Bradley's expression darkened. "I won't stand here and have you accuse my officers of misconduct without proof." "Proof?" Samuel repeated, gesturing to the bystanders. "There are dozens of witnesses, recordings, and a child with a handprint on his face. Is that not enough for you?" Bradley ignored the comment, his eyes scanning the crowd. Let's not blow this out of proportion. My officers acted within their training and authority. Perhaps if these young men had cooperated, none of this would have happened. Deshawn took a step forward, anger flashing in his eyes. Cooperate? We didn't do anything wrong. Your officers cornered us for no reason. Bradley's gaze shifted to Deshawn, his tone growing colder. Watch your tone, son. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. Samuel stepped between them, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Enough. You will not intimidate these boys any further. If you're here to protect your officers, let me remind you that their actions today are indefensible. Bradley's lips thinned, and for a moment, the two men locked eyes in a silent battle of wills. Mr. King, Bradley said finally, his tone icy. You may think you're some sort of savior, but you're meddling in matters you don't understand. The law is on our side. Samuel tilted his head, his calm demeanor unwavering. The law, Captain Hayes, is supposed to be on the side of justice. And today, justice isn't on your side. The crowd erupted in applause, emboldened by Samuel's words. Bradley's jaw tightened, and his hand clenched into a fist at his side. I suggest you take those boys and leave, Bradley said through gritted teeth. Before this escalates further. Samuel took a deliberate step forward, his voice low but firm. I'm not going anywhere, Captain. Not until you and your officers are held accountable. You've underestimated the people standing here today. We're watching, and we will not let this go unanswered. Suddenly, a voice called out from the crowd. Samuel, we've got the footage. Everything from the park. A young woman stepped forward, holding her phone high. The screen showed a clear video of Jason slapping Jamal, followed by the harassment of Deshawn and Malik. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy surging with newfound evidence. Bradley's confident facade began to crack. His eyes darted from the phone to the crowd, then back to Samuel. This doesn't prove anything, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. It proves enough, Samuel replied. And it's going to the media, the mayor, and every watchdog organization in this city. Bradley took a step back, clearly shaken. He glanced at his patrol car, then at the officers who had retreated earlier, now lingering nervously on the sidelines. This isn't over, Bradley said, his voice a mix of frustration and desperation. Samuel smiled faintly, his gaze unyielding. You're right, Captain. It's just beginning. As Bradley retreated to his car, the crowd erupted in cheers and chants, their voices echoing through the streets. Samuel turned to Deshawn, Malik, and Jamal, his expression softening. You did good today, he told them. Your courage is what will change this city. Deshawn nodded, his chest swelling with pride. What happens now? Samuel looked out at the crowd, his resolve stronger than ever. Now we make sure they can't ignore us. But just as he spoke, a loud bang echoed from the direction of the park, silencing the crowd. Samuel's heart dropped as he turned toward the sound, his mind racing. What was that? Jamal whispered, clinging to Samuel's arm. Samuel's jaw tightened. Stay close to me. With the crowd following at a cautious distance, Samuel led the boys back toward the park. The scene they found was chaotic, officers scrambling, civilians shouting, and a figure lying on the ground near a patrol car. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he moved closer. The figure was Jason Carter, clutching his leg as blood pooled beneath him. An officer standing nearby held a smoking gun, his face pale and shaken. What happened? Samuel demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. The officer stammered, He went for my gun. I had no choice. The crowd erupted into chaos, some shouting accusations while others tried to piece together what had happened. Samuel knelt beside Jason, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. Jason's face was pale, and his breathing was labored. He looked up at Samuel, his expression a mixture of pain and fear. I didn't, he whispered weakly. Samuel's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The situation had spiraled out of control, and the stakes had just risen higher than he could have imagined. Samuel knelt beside Jason, his eyes scanning the officer's pale, sweat-drenched face. Blood seeped through Jason's fingers as he clutched his wounded leg, groaning in pain. The chaotic scene around them blurred, but Samuel's focus remained razor-sharp. What happened here? Samuel demanded, his voice cutting through the noise. The officer who had fired the shot, a younger man with wide, panicked eyes, stammered, He grabbed for my gun. I didn't know what else to do. It was him or me. The crowd grew louder, their voices a mix of disbelief and outrage. That's a lie, someone shouted. Where's the body cam footage? Another voice demanded. Samuel straightened, his gaze piercing the young officer. Are you telling me a trained officer of the law couldn't restrain a wounded man without resorting to lethal force? The officer's face reddened, but before he could respond, Captain Bradley Hayes returned to the scene, his expression as dark as a storm cloud. Stand down, King, Bradley barked, stepping between Samuel and the younger officer. You're not in charge here. Samuel folded his arms, his stance unyielding. And neither are you, Captain. This has gone too far. He gestured toward Jason, whose breathing was growing more erratic. That man needs medical attention, and we need answers. Bradley's jaw tightened, but he nodded toward a paramedic who had just arrived. Take care of him, he ordered. As the paramedic began tending to Jason, Samuel turned to the crowd. Did anyone here see what happened? A middle-aged man raised his hand. I was standing right there. Jason was yelling at the other officers, saying they'd left him out to dry. Then he took a step forward, and the rookie just panicked and shot him. The young officer's face went pale. That's not true. He went for my gun. You were scared, Samuel interrupted, his tone cutting but not unkind. And instead of de-escalating, you pulled the trigger. Bradley stepped forward, his voice rising. King, you don't know what you're talking about. This situation was dangerous, and my officers acted within protocol. Samuel turned to him, his eyes blazing. You call this protocol? An officer assaulting a child in a public park? Harassing teenagers? And now shooting one of your own? If this is your idea of justice, Captain, then it's time for a new system. The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy shifting from anger to determination. Bradley's face flushed with frustration as he realized he was losing control of the narrative. Enough of this. Bradley shouted. Disperse the crowd now. Several officers moved toward the gathering, but the people stood their ground. Phones remained raised, recording every moment. Samuel held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. No one here is going anywhere. Not until we get the truth. Bradley glared at him. You're inciting a riot. Samuel chuckled darkly. This isn't a riot, Captain. This is accountability. Before Bradley could respond, the paramedic called out. He's stable for now, but we need to get him to a hospital. Jason, barely conscious, weakly lifted his head. His voice was faint but desperate. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Samuel leaned down, his tone soft but urgent. What wasn't supposed to happen, Jason? Talk to me. Jason's lips trembled, but his words were barely audible. They said, keep them scared, keep them in line. Samuel's heart sank as he pieced together the implications of Jason's confession. Before he could press further, Bradley barked, that's enough. Get him out of here. The paramedics quickly loaded Jason onto a stretcher, wheeling him toward the ambulance. Samuel turned to Bradley, his expression unreadable. You're hiding something. Bradley's smirk returned, though it was weaker now. You don't know what you're talking about. Not yet, Samuel replied, his voice steady. But I will. As the ambulance pulled away, Samuel turned back to the crowd. We need to stay organized. This isn't just about one incident. This is about systemic failure. We need to take action. Deshaun stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined. What can we do? Samuel looked at him, then at the crowd. We start by gathering every piece of evidence we have, videos, witness statements, anything that shows the truth. Then we take it to the media, to the city council, to anyone who will listen. And we don't stop until change happens. The crowd murmured in agreement, their resolve solidifying. A young woman stepped forward, holding her phone. I've got everything from earlier, including what happened with Jamal. I'll upload it to social media right now. Samuel nodded. Good. Make sure it spreads. The more people see it, the harder it will be for them to cover this up. Jamal tugged on Samuel's coat. Are they going to stop now? He asked, his voice small. Samuel knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Not yet, Jamal. But we're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else. You've been so brave today. The boy nodded, though his eyes still held a trace of fear. As the crowd began to disperse, Samuel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from a reporter he trusted. Saw the videos. Call me ASAP. This story needs to go live tonight. Samuel's expression hardened. The battle ahead was going to be long and grueling, but he wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and a city full of people who were ready to fight for justice. But just as Samuel turned to leave, a hand grabbed his arm. He looked up to see the young officer who had fired the shot, his face pale and his eyes full of fear. "Mr. King," the officer said, his voice trembling. I need to talk to you. Alone." Samuel's eyes narrowed, his heart pounding as he sensed the weight of what was about to be revealed. Samuel studied the young officer's face. His wide eyes and trembling hands betrayed a mix of fear and regret. The crowd lingered at a distance, their murmurs fading into the background as Samuel gestured for the officer to step aside. Jamal clutched Samuel's coat tightly, reluctant to let him go, but Samuel knelt down and reassured the boy with a soft smile. "Stay close to Deshaun and Malik," Samuel said gently. "I'll be right back." Jamal nodded, his trust in Samuel unwavering despite the day's events. As Samuel and the officer moved toward a quieter corner of the park, Samuel crossed his arms, his voice calm but firm. "What's on your mind, officer?" The young man swallowed hard. "Officer Kyle Morrison." He glanced around nervously before lowering his voice. "I need to tell you something, but if anyone finds out I talked to you—" "Calm down," Samuel interrupted. "You came to me for a reason. Speak the truth, and I'll make sure you're protected." Kyle nodded, his breathing uneven. "It's about Captain Hayes, and the others. They've been running things their own way for years. What happened today, it's not a mistake. It's how they operate." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Go on." Kyle hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "There's an unofficial rule in the precinct. Keep the neighborhoods under control. That means stopping people for no reason, using intimidation, making arrests even when they're not justified. It's all about keeping people scared and quiet." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "And Captain Hayes oversees this?" Kyle nodded. "Him, and a few others higher up. They make it clear that we're supposed to enforce the rules, even if it means bending the law." "Bending the law?" Samuel asked, his tone sharp. Kyle looked away, shame written across his face. "Planting evidence, roughing people up, lying in reports. If anyone questions it, they get shut down fast. Promotions, pay raises, they only go to the officers who play along." Samuel took a deep breath, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "And Jason Carter? Was he part of this?" Kyle hesitated. Jason was desperate. He wanted a promotion, and Hayes promised him one if he could make an example out of someone. That's why he went after the boy in the park. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides. He slapped a child to impress his captain? Kyle nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, but it backfired. When Hayes found out, he was furious. Said Jason was too reckless and had drawn too much attention. That's when everything started falling apart." Samuel leaned in, his voice low and steady. "And the shooting? What really happened?" Kyle's face paled. "Jason was angry, yelling at Hayes for throwing him under the bus. I panicked. He reached toward me, and I thought he was going for my gun." Samuel's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained stern. "And now you're here, confessing all of this. Why?" Kyle's voice broke. "Because I can't do it anymore. I became a cop to protect people, not this. And now, seeing what happened today, I realize I've been part of the problem." Samuel placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder. "It's not too late to make things right. But you need to be ready for what's coming. This isn't just a scandal, it's a system we're about to expose." Kyle nodded, though fear still lingered in his eyes. "What do I do?" "Start by documenting everything," Samuel said. "Every instance of corruption you've witnessed, every name involved. I'll connect you with people who can protect you and make sure your testimony is heard." Kyle hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Samuel straightened, his resolve stronger than ever. "Good. Now go back to the precinct and act normal. I'll be in touch." Kyle walked away, his steps unsteady but determined. Samuel watched him go, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd just learned. As Samuel returned to the group, Deshaun stepped forward. "What did he say?" Samuel shook his head. "Not here. I'll explain later." For now, we need to stay focused. Jamal tugged on Samuel's coat. Are we going home now? Samuel knelt down, his voice gentle. Not yet, Jamal. But I promise, I'll get you home soon. We just need to make sure everything's safe first. Jamal nodded, his trust in Samuel unwavering. Before Samuel could say more, his phone buzzed again. It was the reporter who had messaged him earlier. He answered, his voice calm but urgent. This is Samuel. The voice on the other end was quick and direct. Samuel, it's Laura Mitchell. I've seen the videos, and this story is explosive. We need to meet tonight to go over everything. Where? Samuel asked. I'll text you the address, Laura replied. And bring any witnesses you can. The more voices, the stronger the impact. I'll be there, Samuel said, ending the call. He turned to Deshaun and Malik. You two are coming with me. We're going to tell your story to someone who can help. The boys exchanged a nervous glance but nodded. Okay, Deshaun said. Samuel placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder. You'll come too. Your story matters just as much as theirs. Jamal's eyes widened. Really? Really, Samuel said with a smile. You're braver than you know, Jamal. Later that evening, Samuel and the boys arrived at a small office tucked away in the heart of the city. Laura Mitchell, a seasoned investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption, greeted them at the door. Samuel, she said, shaking his hand. It's good to see you again. Laura, Samuel replied. I wish it were under better circumstances. Laura ushered them inside, her expression serious. Let's get to work. As the boys shared their accounts, Laura's face hardened, her pen flying across her notebook. When the videos were played, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. This is worse than I thought, she said. But it's also exactly what we need to blow this wide open. Samuel nodded. We need this story out there as soon as possible. Hayes and his officers are counting on silence to cover their tracks. Laura looked at him, her eyes blazing with determination. By tomorrow morning, this city won't be silent. But just as she spoke, a loud crash came from the hallway. Everyone froze as the sound of heavy footsteps echoed closer. Samuel rose from his seat, his body tensing. Stay behind me, he said quietly, positioning himself between the boys and the door. The door burst open, revealing two men in plain clothes, their faces cold and expressionless. One of them held up a badge. Samuel King, the man said, his voice sharp. You're coming with us. Samuel stood his ground, his piercing gaze fixed on the two men in the doorway. The tension in the room was palpable as the boys huddled behind him, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Laura Mitchell, always composed under pressure, stepped forward, her pen poised in her hand like a weapon. And who might you be? Laura asked, her tone sharp and demanding. The man who had spoken earlier held up his badge again, his face unreadable. Detective Raymond Cole. This is Detective Harris. We're with Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs? Samuel repeated, skepticism dripping from his voice. You expect me to believe IA storms into private meetings without notice? You're not here for justice. You're here to shut us up. Cole's jaw tightened, but he forced a thin smile. We're here to investigate today's incident, Mr. King. And we need your full cooperation. Investigate. Laura interjected, stepping closer. That's rich, considering the department's track record. Where was IA when those officers were harassing kids in the park? Harris, the quieter of the two, took a step forward, his voice low but firm. We're not here to debate the department's policies. Mr. King needs to come with us for questioning. Samuel crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. If you want to question me, you can do it here. I'm not leaving these boys unprotected. Cole's thin veneer of patience began to crack. This isn't a request, Mr. King. Either you come with us, or we'll have to. Try it, Laura interrupted, her voice cold. She held up her phone, the camera already recording. Go ahead and show the world how IA handles whistleblowers and witnesses. I'm sure the public will love this story. Harris exchanged a glance with Cole, his unease evident. We don't need this getting messy, he muttered. Cole hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Fine. We'll ask our questions here. Samuel gestured to the table, his voice calm but commanding. Then sit. But let me make one thing clear, you're not here to intimidate anyone. If you try, this meeting ends, and I take this story straight to the mayor's office." The detectives sat down, their movements stiff and reluctant. Samuel remained standing, his arms crossed as he watched them closely. "Let's start with the shooting," Cole said, pulling out a notebook. "You were present when Officer Carter was shot. Tell us exactly what happened." Samuel's expression didn't waver. "I think you already know what happened. Your officers panicked, and one of them shot their own man. If you want specifics, you should talk to the witnesses and review the footage." Cole's eyes narrowed. "We're asking you, Mr. King." "I've already given my statement to the press," Samuel replied, his tone steady. "You're welcome to read it in tomorrow's paper." Harris leaned forward, his voice softer but no less insistent. "Mr. King, this isn't just about the shooting. There are allegations about your involvement in inciting a crowd and obstructing police operations." Samuel let out a dry laugh. "You mean standing up for children being harassed and assaulted? If that's obstruction, then I'll gladly wear the label." Cole slammed his notebook shut, his frustration boiling over. "This is a waste of time. He's not going to cooperate." "You're right," Samuel said, his tone cutting. "I'm not here to cooperate with a system that protects its own corruption. If you want answers, start by looking at Captain Hayes and his precinct. They're the ones running this show." Cole stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "This isn't over." "No," Samuel replied, his voice cold. "It's just beginning." The detectives left, their frustration evident in their tense movements. The room remained silent until the sound of the door closing echoed through the space. Laura exhaled sharply, breaking the tension. "They're desperate," she said, shaking her head. "That's a good sign." Samuel nodded. "It means we're getting too close to the truth." Deshawn stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Probably," Samuel admitted. "But they won't stop me. They can try to scare us, but the truth is louder than their threats." Laura looked at her notes, her expression grim. "This story is bigger than I thought. If what those detectives said is true, they're trying to shift the blame onto you. We need to stay ahead of them." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We will. But first, we need to protect these boys." Jamal tugged on Samuel's sleeve. "Are they going to hurt us?" Samuel knelt down, his voice gentle but firm. "No, Jamal. I won't let that happen. You're safe with me." The boy nodded, though the fear in his eyes hadn't entirely disappeared. Later that night, Samuel sat in his modest apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The city's skyline glowed faintly in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness that loomed over its institutions. His phone buzzed on the table. It was Kyle Morrison, the young officer who had confessed earlier. Samuel answered, his tone cautious. "Kyle." Kyle's voice was tense. "I've been digging through old reports, trying to piece everything together. There's more than I thought. Hayes has been covering up misconduct for years. False arrests, planted evidence, even payouts to keep victims quiet." Samuel's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you have proof?" "Some," Kyle replied. "But I'll need more time to get everything. If anyone finds out what I'm doing—" "They won't," Samuel interrupted. "Stay quiet, keep digging, and send me everything you find." "Understood," Kyle said. "But Samuel, be careful. Hayes isn't just dangerous. He's connected. If he feels cornered, he won't go down without a fight." Samuel nodded, though his jaw tightened. "I know. And I'm ready." As he hung up, a knock at the door startled him. He froze for a moment, then approached cautiously. Peering through the peephole, he saw a shadowy figure standing just out of reach of the porch light. "Who is it?" Samuel called out, his voice steady. The figure stepped closer, and Samuel's breath caught. It was Captain Hayes, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," Hayes said, his voice calm but ominous. Samuel opened the door just enough to meet Hayes's gaze. "If you're here to threaten me, save your breath." Hayes smirked faintly. "I'm not here to threaten you, King. I'm here to make you an offer." Samuel didn't budge, his hand gripping the edge of the door as his eyes locked on Captain Hayes. The faint smirk on Hayes's face irritated him, but he forced himself to remain calm. This man, he knew, thrived on control, and Samuel wasn't about to hand it to him. "I don't deal in offers made at my doorstep, Hayes," Samuel said. "If you've got something to say, make it quick." Hayes took a slow step forward, his hands tucked casually in his coat pockets. "You're a smart man, King. Smarter than most of the people I deal with. That's why I'm here, because I think you understand how the world works." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "And how's that, exactly?" Hayes smiled faintly, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Power isn't about being right or wrong. It's about control. You think you're exposing corruption, but all you're doing is kicking a hornet's nest. No matter what you find, the system will protect itself. That's the way it's always been, and it's the way it'll always be." Samuel's jaw tightened. "If that's your way of telling me to back off, you're wasting your time. I don't scare easily." Hayes let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "I'm not here to scare you, King. I'm here to give you a way out." "A way out of what?" Samuel asked, his tone sharp. Hayes stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial tone. "You walk away. Stop digging. Let this whole thing die down, and in return, I make sure you and your little group don't get hurt. You think the system is against you now? You haven't seen what it can really do." Samuel stared at Hayes, his expression unreadable. "So that's your offer. A quiet surrender in exchange for protection." Hayes nodded. "It's better than the alternative. You're smart enough to know when you're outmatched." Samuel let the silence hang in the air for a moment before leaning slightly closer. His voice was quiet but firm, each word cutting through the tension. "You've made one mistake, Hayes. You think fear is enough to stop people like me. It isn't." Hayes's smirk faltered for the first time, and Samuel seized the moment. "You can threaten me, try to bribe me, even send your officers to my door, but it won't change the truth," Samuel continued. "The system you're so proud of is crumbling, and you know it. That's why you're here, because you're scared." Hayes's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "I tried to be civil, King. But if you won't take my offer, don't say I didn't warn you." Samuel opened the door wider, his stance unyielding. "You know your way out." For a moment, Hayes hesitated, as if considering one last attempt to intimidate Samuel. But then he turned sharply and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet night. Samuel watched until Hayes disappeared down the street, then closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. His mind raced with the implications of the encounter. Hayes wasn't just trying to save face, he was desperate. And that meant Samuel and his allies were making progress. The next morning, Samuel met Laura Mitchell and the boys at a local cafe. The early sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the otherwise tense group. Laura was already deep in conversation with a contact on her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she typed notes. Jamal sat beside Samuel, his small hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate. Deshaun and Malik sat across from them, their expressions weary but determined. Laura ended her call and turned to Samuel. "The story's live," she said. "It's already spreading like wildfire. Social media is buzzing, and local news stations are picking it up." Samuel nodded. "Good. The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for Hayes to bury it." Deshaun leaned forward, his voice hesitant. "What happens now? Are they going to come after us?" Samuel met his gaze, his voice steady. "They might try. But you're not alone in this. We'll make sure you're protected." As they spoke, Laura's phone buzzed with a flurry of notifications. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing. "This is strange," she muttered. "What is it?" Samuel asked. Laura turned the screen toward him. "There's already pushback online. Anonymous accounts claiming the videos are fake, that this is all part of some anti-police agenda." Samuel's jaw tightened. "Hayes is moving faster than I expected." Jamal looked up, his voice small. "Does that mean people won't believe us?" Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The truth has a way of breaking through lies, Jamal. We just have to keep pushing." Laura nodded, her fingers resuming their rapid typing. "I'll counter the smear campaign with facts. If they want to play dirty, we'll be ready." Later that afternoon, Samuel received a call from Kyle Morrison. The young officer's voice was shaky but determined. "I've got more," Kyle said. "Records, emails, even audio clips. Hayes and his team have been covering up misconduct for years. It's worse than I thought. Send everything to Laura," Samuel instructed. "And be careful, Kyle. If Hayes suspects you're working with us." "He already does," Kyle interrupted. "I think someone tipped him off. My locker was trashed this morning, and my car's been keyed. I'm not safe at the precinct anymore. Samuel's stomach churned, but he kept his voice steady. Stay out of sight. We'll figure something out. As he hung up, a sinking feeling settled over him. Hayes wasn't just playing defense anymore, he was escalating. That evening, Samuel returned to his apartment, his mind racing with the day's developments. As he unlocked the door, a faint sound made him freeze. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a quiet click coming from inside. He pushed the door open cautiously, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but a closer look revealed small signs of intrusion: a slightly ajar drawer, a displaced chair, a faint scuff mark on the floor. Someone had been there. Samuel's breath quickened as he stepped further inside, his senses on high alert. He turned toward his desk, where his laptop sat. The screen was on, and a single message was displayed in bold text. Walk away, or we come for everyone you care about. Samuel stared at the message on the screen, his mind racing. The audacity of the threat fueled his anger, but he forced himself to think clearly. This wasn't a time for rash decisions. Whoever had broken in wanted him rattled, and he wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. He quickly scanned the room for any further signs of tampering. His files, the ones he kept locked in a cabinet, were untouched. His phone and other electronics seemed undisturbed. It was a warning, not a robbery. Pulling out his phone, Samuel took a photo of the message on the laptop and then immediately shut the device down. If they'd planted spyware or malware, he didn't want to risk further exposure. His next move was to call Laura Mitchell. She picked up on the first ring. "Samuel," she said, her voice tense. "What's wrong?" "They've escalated," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "Someone broke into my apartment. They left a message on my laptop. Walk away, or we come for everyone you care about." Laura cursed under her breath. "Do you think they're serious, or is it just intimidation?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "But I can't take the risk. We need to move fast. Do you have a secure place where I can store sensitive documents? They might come after the evidence next." "I do," Laura said. "Bring everything to my office. I'll encrypt and back it up. But Samuel, be careful. If they've reached this point, they're desperate." "Desperation makes people dangerous," Samuel agreed. "I'll head over soon." Before leaving, Samuel made sure to secure the apartment. He packed the critical documents he had collected, including the evidence Kyle had shared, and stored them in a backpack. As he stepped outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The quiet hum of the city felt heavier tonight, every shadow along the sidewalk seeming to stretch unnaturally long. Samuel tightened his grip on the backpack and quickened his pace. About halfway to Laura's office, a black SUV pulled up beside him. The tinted windows rolled down just enough to reveal a man in a suit, his face partially obscured by the dim light. "Get in," the man said, his voice calm but firm. Samuel stopped, his instincts screaming danger. "Who are you?" "A friend," the man replied. "You're in over your head, Mr. King. If you don't get in, you won't make it to wherever you're going." Samuel's pulse quickened. "And if I do get in?" The man smiled faintly. "Then maybe we can help each other." Samuel glanced around. The street was eerily empty, the usual bustle of the city nowhere to be seen. Whoever this man was, he had planned this encounter carefully. "I'll pass," Samuel said, taking a step back. The man's smile faded. "You're making a mistake." Samuel turned and began walking again, his every sense on high alert. Behind him, the SUV idled for a moment before driving away, its tires screeching as it disappeared into the night. When Samuel finally reached Laura's office, she was waiting for him at the door. Her sharp eyes scanned the street behind him as he stepped inside. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked. "Maybe," Samuel replied. "A black SUV tried to intercept me on the way here. Some guy claiming he wanted to help." Laura's expression darkened. "That's not good." "They're tightening their grip." Samuel set the backpack on her desk. "This is everything I have. Kyle's documents, my own notes, witness statements. Encrypt it, back it up, and make sure it's ready to go public if anything happens to me." Laura gave him a sharp look. "Don't talk like that. We're not losing you in this fight." Samuel smiled faintly. "I'm not planning on going anywhere. But we need to be prepared." Laura nodded, her focus shifting to her computer. As she worked, Samuel paced the room, his thoughts racing. "What's our next move?" Laura asked, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "We bring more people into the fold," Samuel said. "Community leaders, activists, anyone who can amplify this story. If we make enough noise, Hayes won't be able to silence us." Laura nodded. "I'll reach out to my contacts tonight. The story is already spreading, but we need to keep the momentum going." As she spoke, Samuel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Kyle. "They know I've been talking to you. Hayes called me into his office. I think I'm in serious trouble." Samuel's stomach churned. He quickly typed a response. "Get out of there. Now." Kyle replied almost instantly, "I can't. He's watching me. What do I do?" Samuel cursed under his breath. "Kyle's in danger," he told Laura. "What happened?" "Hayes knows he's been talking to us. Kyle's trapped at the precinct." Laura's eyes widened. "We need to get him out of there before it's too late." Samuel nodded, his mind racing. "I have a friend who might be able to help. Someone with connections in the department. Let me make a call." As Samuel stepped into a quiet corner of the office, he dialed the number of an old ally, Marcus Boone. A retired detective turned private investigator, Marcus had a reputation for being both resourceful and fearless. "Samuel," Marcus said as he answered. "It's been a while. What's going on?" "I need your help," Samuel said, quickly explaining Kyle's situation. Marcus was silent for a moment before responding. "If Hayes is involved, this is going to get messy. But I'll see what I can do. Give me an hour." "Thank you," Samuel said. "Don't thank me yet," Marcus replied. "This isn't over." As Samuel ended the call, a sudden sound from outside made him freeze. The faint crunch of gravel underfoot. He exchanged a glance with Laura, who had also heard it. Slowly, they both moved toward the window. Outside, a group of shadowy figures was approaching the building. At least 3 of them, their movements deliberate and coordinated. "They're here," Laura whispered, her voice tight with fear. Samuel's mind raced. "Stay calm. We're not going to let them win." But even as he spoke, the weight of the situation bore down on him. Hayes wasn't just playing defense anymore, he was coming for them. The faint crunch of gravel grew louder, each step of the intruders outside heightening the tension in the office. Samuel and Laura exchanged a look, their unspoken agreement clear. They couldn't let fear dictate their next move. Samuel motioned for Laura to stay behind the desk while he carefully locked the office door. "Call the police," he whispered. Laura shook her head. "The police? After everything we've seen, how can we trust them?" Samuel hesitated but nodded. "You're right. Call Marcus. He might already be on his way." Laura grabbed her phone and began dialing while Samuel moved toward the window. Peering through the blinds, he counted 3 men standing near the entrance, their figures barely visible under the dim streetlights. 2 were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by caps, while the third, a stocky figure with broad shoulders, lingered in the shadows giving orders. Samuel turned back to Laura. 3 of them. Maybe more. Laura's voice trembled as she whispered into the phone. "Marcus, it's Laura. We've got company. We're at the office, and it's bad. Get here fast." She hung up and looked at Samuel. "He's coming. He says to stay put and not engage." Samuel frowned. "Staying put won't stop them from coming in. We need to hold them off until Marcus gets here." Laura's gaze darted toward the door. "How?" Samuel scanned the office, his mind racing. He spotted a metal paperweight on the desk and picked it up, testing its weight in his hand. "If they come through, we aim to slow them down, not fight them directly. Focus on buying time." Laura nodded, though her hands trembled as she clutched her phone. Outside, the intruders seemed to have finished their discussion. The stocky figure gestured toward the building, and the 2 men in dark clothes approached the door. The first man tested the handle, finding it locked. He muttered something to his partner, who pulled a crowbar from his jacket and began working on the lock. Inside, Samuel heard the faint scraping of metal against metal. "They're trying to break in," he whispered. Laura's breath quickened. "What do we do?" Samuel moved toward the desk, motioning for her to crouch behind it. "Stay low. If they get in, don't move unless I tell you." She nodded, her fear palpable but her resolve unbroken. A loud snap echoed through the room as the lock gave way. The door creaked open, and the two men stepped inside, their movements cautious but confident. Samuel gripped the paperweight tightly, his muscles tense as he prepared for the worst. "Split up," one of the men whispered. "Find the files and anything electronic." The other man nodded and began moving toward the desks, his flashlight sweeping the room. Samuel stayed low, his heart pounding as the man's light drew closer. Just as the intruder stepped within reach, Samuel rose swiftly, swinging the paperweight with precision. It struck the man's wrist, sending the flashlight clattering to the floor. "Damn it," the man hissed, clutching his hand. Samuel didn't wait for him to recover. He grabbed the flashlight and hurled it toward the second intruder, who was rounding the corner. The heavy object struck him square in the chest, forcing him to stumble back. "Who's there?" the second man shouted, his voice sharp with panic. Laura peeked out from behind the desk, her phone still in hand. "I'm calling for help," she yelled, hoping to deter them. "Forget the files," the first man growled. "Get them." The second man lunged toward Samuel, but Samuel sidestepped, using the desk as a barrier. The first man, still nursing his injured wrist, pulled out a knife and advanced. Before the situation could escalate further, the distant wail of a siren pierced the tense air. The sound grew louder, and the two intruders exchanged a look of alarm. "They called the cops," the second man barked. "No, it's not the cops," Samuel said, his voice steady. "It's something worse for you." The men hesitated, their confusion giving way to panic as the sound of tires screeching to a halt echoed outside. The front door burst open, and Marcus Boone stepped in, a baseball bat in one hand and a grim expression on his face. "Party's over, boys," Marcus growled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. The intruders froze, their confidence evaporating. The stocky figure who had remained outside peeked through the doorway but quickly retreated when he saw Marcus. "Let's go," the first man shouted, shoving his partner toward the exit. The two intruders scrambled out of the office, disappearing into the night. Marcus didn't pursue them, instead turning to Samuel and Laura. "Are you two okay?" he asked, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "We're fine," Samuel said, though his voice carried the weight of the encounter. "They didn't get anything." Laura stood, her hands still trembling. "They were after the files. Hayes sent them." Marcus nodded grimly. "Of course he did. And this is just the beginning. Hayes isn't going to stop until he feels like he's won." Samuel clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "Then we make sure he doesn't win." After securing the office and ensuring there were no further intrusions, the three of them sat down to regroup. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "We need to go on the offensive," Marcus said. "Hayes is playing dirty, and he's not afraid to get his hands bloody. If we wait too long, he'll find a way to discredit or silence us." Samuel nodded. "I agree. But we need more than just evidence. We need people. Allies. Voices that Hayes can't ignore." Laura tapped her laptop. "The story's already gaining traction. I'll reach out to more journalists and activists. If we can mobilize public pressure, Hayes will have to answer to someone." Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "Be careful who you trust. Hayes has connections, and he'll use them to twist the narrative." Samuel looked at the files on the desk, the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on him. But as he glanced at Laura and Marcus, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "This isn't just about Hayes," Samuel said. "It's about the system that lets people like him thrive. If we're going to do this, we're going all the way." The following morning, Samuel sat at the kitchen table in Laura's apartment, where the group had decided to meet for safety. The air was thick with the weight of their mission. Laura's laptop hummed softly, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she coordinated with journalists and allies. Marcus was leaning against the counter, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone, his sharp eyes scanning for updates. Deshaun, Malik, and Jamal sat on the couch in the living room, their nervous energy palpable. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they were part of the fight. Samuel rubbed his temples, going over the previous night's events. "Hayes won't stop. He'll push back harder now that we've embarrassed him. We need a move that forces him to react publicly, where he can't control the narrative." Marcus set his coffee down, his face serious. "The only thing that'll do that is exposing his network. Hayes isn't acting alone. If we can link him to others, we'll create a chain reaction they can't contain." Laura turned her screen toward them, revealing a list of names. Kyle's documents gave us a start. These are officers, city officials, and private contractors tied to shady deals and misconduct complaints. If we can corroborate these names with evidence, we'll have something explosive. Samuel nodded. We'll start there. But we need to keep Kyle safe first. He's our most valuable source, and if Hayes gets to him, we lose everything. Laura glanced at her phone. Kyle messaged me an hour ago. He's hiding out at a friend's place, but says he's being followed. We need to get him out of the city. Marcus pulled out his phone and began dialing. I've got a contact who can help with that. I'll arrange transport and a safe house. As Marcus made the call, Samuel turned to Laura. What about public support? Have you heard back from the activists and community leaders? Laura's expression softened. A few have responded. They're willing to organize protests and rallies, but they need more from us, something concrete that'll rally people. Samuel's mind raced. We need to release a preview of the evidence. Just enough to get the public's attention, but not enough to tip Hayes off about our full hand. Laura nodded. I can edit a short video combining the footage from the park and Kyle's leaked documents. If we push it on social media and get the right voices behind it, it'll spread like wildfire. While Laura worked on the video, Marcus finished his call and rejoined the group. Kyle's transport is set for tonight. My contact will take him to a safe house 2 states over. He'll be off Hayes's radar. Good, Samuel said. Let's keep the location between us. The fewer people who know, the safer he'll be. Deshawn, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. What about us? Are we safe? Samuel turned to him, his voice steady. You're safer now than you were yesterday. But if you feel uneasy, we can arrange protection for you and your family. Deshawn hesitated before shaking his head. No. I want to help. Hayes and those cops made me feel like I didn't matter. I want them to see I do. Malik nodded in agreement, his resolve clear. Me too. Jamal's small voice broke the silence. I'm scared, but I want to help too. Samuel knelt beside him, his expression gentle. You've already done so much, Jamal. Your bravery is inspiring. If you want to step back, no one will blame you. Jamal shook his head. I don't want them to hurt other kids. Samuel's chest tightened with pride. You're stronger than you realize, Jamal. I'll make sure you're safe. By evening, Laura had finished the video. It was a short but powerful piece, combining footage of Jason Carter's slap, the harassment of Deshawn and Malik, and excerpts from Kyle's documents exposing the systemic corruption in Hayes's precinct. Ready to upload? Laura asked, her finger hovering over the mouse. Samuel nodded. Do it. Within minutes, the video was live. Laura tagged influential activists, journalists, and community leaders, urging them to share it. The response was immediate. Comments and retweets poured in, each one amplifying the message. Local news stations began contacting Laura for interviews, and hashtags calling for accountability started trending. Marcus smirked as he scrolled through the responses. You've got their attention now. Samuel's phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. He hesitated before answering. This is Samuel. A deep voice responded. Mr. King, this is Mayor Evelyn Carter. I've seen your video. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Madam Mayor. We need to meet, the mayor continued. Tonight. I've heard whispers about Hayes for years, but if what you've presented is true, this changes everything. Can you come to City Hall? Samuel glanced at Marcus and Laura. I'll be there. Later that night, Samuel arrived at City Hall under tight security. He was escorted to a private conference room where Mayor Carter waited. A tall, commanding woman in her early 50s, the mayor exuded authority and focus. Mr. King, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for coming. Samuel shook her hand. Thank you for reaching out, Madam Mayor. We need your help to bring this to light. The mayor gestured for him to sit. I've seen the evidence, and I've heard from people in the community. This isn't just about one precinct. This is a systemic issue, and it's going to take more than public outcry to dismantle it. Samuel leaned forward. We're prepared to do whatever it takes. But we can't do it without the city's support. The mayor nodded. I'll call for an independent investigation into Hayes and his precinct. But be warned, this will provoke backlash. If Hayes feels cornered, he'll fight harder than ever. I'm ready for that, Samuel said firmly. The mayor's expression softened. "You've shown incredible courage, Mr. King. The city owes you a debt of gratitude." As Samuel left City Hall, his phone buzzed with a text from Laura. The video just hit national news. Things are about to get big. Samuel exhaled, the weight of the fight ahead heavy on his shoulders. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. As Samuel stepped into the cool night air, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Kyle. "They're on to me. Hayes's men are here. I'm running." Samuel's heart sank. Kyle's life was in immediate danger, and time was running out. Samuel's pulse raced as he read Kyle's message. The words burned into his mind. "They're on to me. Hayes's men are here. I'm running." He immediately called Kyle, but it went straight to voicemail. He turned to Marcus, who was waiting in the car parked outside City Hall. "Kyle's in trouble. Hayes's men found him." Marcus cursed under his breath, already starting the engine. Where was he last? Samuel relayed the location Kyle had shared earlier, a friend's house near the outskirts of town. As the car sped through the quiet streets, Samuel's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. "Hayes is escalating," Marcus muttered. "He's not just trying to scare us anymore. He's tying up loose ends." Samuel nodded grimly. "We need to find Kyle before they do." As they approached the address, Marcus slowed the car and cut the headlights. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Samuel scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a black SUV parked a few houses down. Two men sat inside, their silhouettes faintly illuminated by the dashboard lights. "Hayes's people," Marcus said, following Samuel's gaze. "They're watching for him." Samuel's phone buzzed with another message from Kyle. "I'm hiding in the old factory near the bridge. They're everywhere." Marcus read the text over Samuel's shoulder. "That factory's a death trap. It's isolated, with only a couple of exits. If they corner him there." "We won't let that happen," Samuel said firmly. Marcus nodded and turned the car around, driving toward the bridge. The factory loomed like a shadow against the night sky, its broken windows and rusted frame a reminder of its abandonment. Marcus parked a block away, and the two men approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows. Samuel's phone buzzed again. Another message from Kyle. "I'm in the second-floor storage room. Please hurry." Samuel texted back quickly, "We're here. Stay hidden." They slipped through a broken side door, the factory's interior dark and silent except for the faint sound of dripping water. The air smelled of rust and decay. Marcus led the way, his flashlight low to avoid detection. As they climbed the stairs, faint voices echoed from somewhere in the building. "Spread out," one voice commanded. "He's here somewhere." Samuel's stomach tightened. Hayes's men were already inside. "Move quietly," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. They reached the second floor, the long hallway lined with empty offices and storage rooms. Marcus signaled for Samuel to stay low as they approached the storage room Kyle had described. Inside, Kyle was huddled in the corner, his face pale and his hands trembling. When he saw Samuel and Marcus, relief washed over him. "You came," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "We're getting you out," Samuel said, crouching beside him. "Can you walk?" Kyle nodded shakily. "Yeah, but they're everywhere. I heard them downstairs." Marcus scanned the room. "We'll take the back stairs. It leads to an alley." As they helped Kyle to his feet, a loud crash echoed from the floor below. "He's on this floor," a voice shouted. "They found us," Marcus hissed. "We need to move now." The trio moved quickly but carefully, their footsteps muffled against the old worn floors. The back staircase was just ahead when a beam of light swept across the hallway. "Stop right there," a voice barked. Samuel turned to see one of Hayes's men at the far end of the hallway, his flashlight aimed directly at them. "Run!" Marcus shouted, pushing Kyle toward the staircase. Samuel and Marcus followed as the man's footsteps thundered behind them. The stairwell echoed with the sound of pursuit as they descended to the first floor. As they burst into the alley, two more men appeared, blocking their path. One of them raised a gun, his voice sharp. "Don't move." Samuel stepped in front of Kyle, his hands raised. "We don't want any trouble. Let us go." The man smirked. "You don't get to walk away, King. Hayes sends his regards." Before he could act, Marcus lunged forward, swinging a crowbar he had grabbed from a factory. The The man stumbled back, his gun clattering to the ground. "Go!" Marcus shouted. Samuel and Kyle sprinted down the alley as Marcus fought off the remaining men. The sound of scuffling and shouts echoed behind them, but Samuel didn't look back. They emerged onto a main street, where Marcus's car was parked. Samuel shoved Kyle inside and slid into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he started the engine. "What about Marcus?" Kyle asked, his voice panicked. Samuel hesitated, his heart pounding. Just as he was about to go back, Marcus appeared, limping but alive. He climbed into the passenger seat, his face bruised but determined. "Drive," Marcus said, his voice firm. Samuel didn't hesitate, the car peeling away from the factory as the figures in the alley receded into the distance. Back at Laura's apartment, Kyle sat on the couch, his hands still trembling. Laura handed him a cup of tea, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "You're safe now," she said softly. Kyle looked up at Samuel, his voice unsteady. "I thought I was done for." Samuel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not. And we're not stopping until Hayes and his men are held accountable." Marcus, holding an ice pack to his bruised face, leaned against the wall. "They're getting bolder. Hayes won't take this lying down. We need to hit him harder." Samuel nodded, his resolve hardening. "We will. But first, we make sure Kyle stays hidden. He's our key to bringing this system down." Laura's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen, her expression darkening. "What is it?" Samuel asked. She turned the screen toward him. It was a breaking news alert. Police Captain Bradley Hayes accuses activist Samuel King of inciting violence and obstruction of justice. Samuel exhaled sharply, the weight of Hayes's counterattack settling over him. "It's a smear campaign," Laura said. "He's trying to discredit you before the investigation gains traction." Samuel clenched his fists. "Let him try. The truth is on our side." Marcus nodded. "Then let's make sure it's loud enough for everyone to hear." The next morning, Samuel awoke to a flood of notifications on his phone. Laura's video had gone viral overnight, triggering a firestorm of public outrage. National news outlets were running segments on the corruption in Hayes's precinct, and activists across the country were rallying behind Samuel and his group. But alongside the support came Hayes's smear campaign. Headlines accused Samuel of inciting riots and obstructing justice. Clips of carefully edited footage painted him as an agitator, a man determined to dismantle law enforcement rather than expose corruption. Samuel sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the barrage of messages. Laura and Marcus joined him, their expressions tense. "We're winning the public battle," Laura said, setting her laptop on the table. "But Hayes is using every resource he has to discredit you. He's even got city council members speaking out against you." Samuel nodded, his jaw tight. That was expected. Hayes knows his position is fragile, and he's trying to protect himself. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "We need to hit him where it hurts. If we expose the people protecting him, the higher-ups who've been covering for him, it'll be over. He won't just lose his position, he'll lose his allies." Kyle, sitting nearby, looked up from his tea. "I have more files," he said quietly. "Financial records. Hayes and some of the city's top officials have been funneling money through fake initiatives. If we can get those out, they'll have no defense." Laura's eyes widened. "That's the kind of evidence we need. If we can tie Hayes to financial crimes, it won't just be the department coming after him, it'll be federal." Samuel nodded. "How soon can we release it?" Kyle hesitated. "I'll need time to organize it. It's a mess of spreadsheets and emails. But once it's ready." "Do it," Samuel said. "And send copies to trusted journalists and lawyers. We need to make sure it doesn't disappear." As Kyle worked on the files, Marcus stepped outside to make a call. He returned a few minutes later, his face grim. "That was one of my contacts in the department," Marcus said. "Hayes knows we're about to drop something big. He's called in favors from his allies, and they're planning a raid on this apartment." Laura froze. "A raid? Under what pretense?" Marcus shrugged. "They'll fabricate something. They'll say they're looking for evidence of your so-called crimes, Samuel. But the real goal is to destroy the files and scare us into silence." Samuel stood, his mind racing. "How long do we have?" "An hour, maybe less," Marcus replied. Samuel turned to Laura and Kyle. "We need to move everything. Files, laptops, everything. If they find anything here, they'll twist it to their advantage. Laura nodded, already packing her laptop and hard drives. Where do we take it? Marcus tapped his phone. I've got a safe location outside the city. They won't find it there. The group moved quickly, gathering their evidence and preparing to leave. Just as they were about to step outside, the faint sound of sirens reached their ears. They're early, Marcus muttered, his hand tightening around the duffel bag of evidence. Samuel glanced at the others. We split up. Marcus and I will take the files to the safe location. Laura, you take the boys somewhere secure and keep a low profile. Kyle, stay with Laura. If they find you, it's over. Laura hesitated, then nodded. Be careful. You too, Samuel replied. As Marcus and Samuel sped away in the car, the sirens grew louder behind them. Marcus swerved through side streets, his experience as a former detective evident in the way he avoided main roads. They'll try to stop us, Marcus said. But as long as we don't get boxed in, we'll make it. Samuel glanced out the window, his heart pounding. This is bigger than us now. Even if they catch us, the evidence is out there. They can't stop the truth. Ahead, a police barricade loomed, blocking the road. Marcus cursed and turned sharply into an alley, the car's tires screeching. We're not out of this yet, Marcus said, his jaw tight. Meanwhile, Laura and the boys arrived at a small motel on the edge of town. Laura checked them in under a fake name and ushered everyone into a room. Stay quiet, she said, locking the door. We're safe for now. Kyle sat on the bed, his hands shaking. They won't stop, will they? No, Laura admitted. But we're stronger than they think. Samuel and Marcus will make it. Deshaun and Malik huddled in the corner, their faces pale but determined. Jamal sat beside Kyle, his small hand resting on the officer's arm. We'll win, Jamal said softly. We have to. Back on the road, Marcus and Samuel finally reached the safe location, a secluded storage unit on the outskirts of the city. Marcus backed the car into the unit, and the two men quickly unloaded the files and equipment. As they secured the unit, Samuel's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a news alert. Anonymous source leaks financial records tied to police corruption scandal. Samuel smiled faintly. Kyle must have sent the files. It's out. Marcus grinned. Then we've got them. Just as they closed the storage unit, the sound of approaching engines filled the air. A black SUV and two police cruisers screeched to a halt outside. Guess they tracked us, Marcus muttered, pulling out his phone. Samuel stood beside him, his heart pounding but his resolve firm. This is it. The officers stepped out of their vehicles, their weapons drawn. The lead officer, flanked by two men in plain clothes, barked, hands up. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice. Samuel raised his hands, his voice steady. Justice? Is that what you call this? We've already won. The evidence is out. Everyone knows the truth. The plainclothes man stepped forward, his face familiar. It was Hayes. You think this is over? Hayes snarled, his eyes blazing with fury. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Marcus smirked. We know exactly who we're dealing with. And so does the rest of the country now. Hayes's expression faltered, the weight of the moment settling over him. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Suddenly, another set of sirens pierced the air. More cars pulled up, but these weren't Hayes's allies. They bore the insignia of the FBI. The agents stepped out, their leader holding a warrant. Bradley Hayes, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and obstruction of justice. Hayes froze, his face pale. This is a mistake, he shouted. I'm being set up. The agents ignored him, moving to cuff him as the officers who had accompanied him looked on in stunned silence. Samuel lowered his hands, a wave of relief washing over him. We did it, Marcus said quietly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Samuel nodded, his gaze steady. This is just the beginning. There's more work to be done.